Thank you very much, and thanks, Peter, for a really stimulating opening to our workshop this evening. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm representing two people, myself, obviously, and my co-collaborator, Dr. Anne-Marie Einhaus at Northumbria University. And what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is to take you through an AHRC-funded project that came to an end in August 2014 called The First World War in the Classroom, Teaching and the Construction of Cultural Memory. And the aspiration of that project was to look in more depth as to what teachers were doing in both history and English literature classrooms in England, and what this means for the teaching of the First World War. So I'm going to just talk you through our project and give you an insight into some of the main findings from both our English literature survey and our history survey. If any of you would like more information, www.intheclassroom.exeter.ac.uk is our active project website. You'll find various resources on that website, but you'll also find different project reports, a brief project report and a full project report, free to download as PDFs. So you might find some of the things that I'm talking about this evening interesting, and if you'd like to find out more, then that's the place to go. So, what was the project? As I said, it was funded by the AHRC through one of their themes, which is still running. It's one of their main themes, Care for the Future. And it was an exploratory award, which in itself meant that we had to think very carefully about the boundaries and remit of our project. So it was in part the reason why we chose to look at English secondary schools. But obviously the other reason for that was because of the differing national curriculums around the UK. So we wanted to have some reasonable boundary to our project. The project ran from February 2013 to August 2014, and as you've probably picked up on, it was very much about interdisciplinarity. So I'm a historian, my colleague Anne-Marie is an English literature scholar. So we wanted to try and approach this from an interdisciplinary perspective. As a result, that meant our partner organisations were very interdisciplinary. We worked closely with the English Association and the Historical Association, who couldn't have been more supportive and more helpful, and we worked with the Institute of Education, as well as setting up an academic advisory board, of which we've got a member here this evening from the University of Northampton, and a teaching steering committee as well. So those teachers who expressed an early interest in the project became part of our steering committee. So we lent on them for things like adapting versions of the survey and analysing some of our results. The methodology was to start with an initial workshop which brought together teachers, representatives of exam boards and academics from both disciplines, as well as the discipline of education studies, to discuss some of the ideas surrounding the project and to start putting together the initial basis of the survey. I should add at this point that the IOE was very much involved because what we were trying to do with the First World War was emulate what they'd done with their much larger, much better funded project on teaching about the Holocaust in English secondary schools. So we were trying to emulate that project, but looking at the First World War as the subject area. We then developed a survey that went online through Bristol Online Surveys. And then whilst the survey was still open, we held a variety of regional focus groups around England. And then in May 2014, we held an end of project event. Again, bringing back some of the people that had been at our initial workshop, but also welcoming new people to our project. And I think if there's just one image that really sums up what we were trying to do, it's this one, which comes from our initial workshop. My colleague Anne-Marie is there at the back, looking very interested and engaged. And essentially, the whole project was founded on this idea of dialogue and discussion and exchange. We didn't want it to be a project where we just extracted and took and gave nothing back. We didn't want it to be a project where we stood and wagged our finger from our ivory tower. We wanted it to be very much a co-produced project, although we didn't actually use that word co-produced, but that's exactly what we were trying to do, I think, to really engage with teachers and listen to teachers and to find out from teachers what they were doing. These were our research questions, and I think, very clearly, Anne-Marie and I, for a long time, and we're friends, we go back a long way, we were very galvanised by this strong perception, particularly amongst military historians in this country, that teachers weren't teaching the First World War the right way. And this has been come to the foreground of media, particularly with Michael Gove's comments in January 2014, when in fact our project was over halfway through. saying that teachers are teaching the subject wrong, they're using Blackadder, that's wrong. And then the likes of Jeremy Paxman weighed in saying, you know, that the war is only ever taught by poetry now. So there's all of these assumptions, and there were all of these headlines, very catchy headlines that really targeted teachers, we felt. But no one had actually bothered to ask teachers what they did and what they wanted to do and what stopped them from doing what they wanted to do. So these are our 4 main research questions. How is the First World War taught in English secondary schools, in English and history? And we were particularly interested in the GCSE and AS A-level curricula. Does teaching of the First World War contribute to the formation of a specific cultural memory of the war / the supporting of a specific literary canon that emphasises a select group of poet truth speakers? We wanted to find out what was happening in secondary school classrooms, and we wanted to find out from teachers what they felt the challenges and opportunities were. Now, these are some of our main general findings, and then for the rest of my talk this evening I'm going to look specifically first at English results and then at history results. So I just thought I'd start with a general overview, and I think what really stood out to Anne-Marie and myself was this strong dedication felt amongst the teaching community that we engaged with, that the First World War was a topic that they were very much dedicated to teaching. Now, there is a methodological issue here in that those teachers that were engaged in our project were volunteers. They were a self-selecting group of enthusiasts who were happy to give up time in their half term to come to our workshop, who were happy to give up time in their summer holidays or in their early autumn term to fill in our survey. So, you know, I'm very aware of this caveat, and it's a methodological issue that I'm not sure anyone has successfully answered yet. How do you engage with the uninterested teacher for whatever reason? It might be that, you know, the Tudors is their thing, whatever. But you know, we're very aware that we were dealing with a group of teachers who were very dedicated to the topic. But still, we were struck by this sense of dedication, and a sense of dedication to trying to do justice to the topic. One of the main conclusions that we came to was that if there was where there is an emphasis placed on traditional First World War texts or traditional First World War topics, it was primarily a result of practical factors. So, for example, exam boards. Setting particular subject questions that then teachers have to respond to because they're going to be berated, you know, the tyranny of exams and exam boards, and tyranny of league tables. They have to respond to this. They can't just go off piste and start teaching something that they feel passionate about if it's not going to appear in the exam, the exams that count for their students. We did find there was more freedom in the years preceding GCSE and A-level for obvious reasons. And there's also practical issues such as, you know, if you've got 100 copies of Private Peaceful in your stock cupboard, you're going to have to make a really good case to your head teacher if you want to start using a different text with your students. So there's very logistical, practical issues. We definitely found, particularly in terms of our trying to listen to teachers and to really take lessons from the teachers we worked with, that there has to be more accessible, that academic research has to be more accessible. You know, the 65 quid OUP monograph, you know, 400 pages, you know, teachers don't have the time or necessarily the funds to engage with that type of research. What you need is accessible, online, free, easy to reach, easy to absorb, and stuff that's not going to take up loads of your free time. And we also found that teachers were really responsive to the idea of academics engaging with CPD. So one of the things we've done with our website is set up a sort of willing volunteer table. So academics who are willing to engage in what schools are doing, or have a chat over the phone with a teacher, or maybe do a Skype session into their school, or maybe come into their school, they've put themselves forward, and then through our website teachers can make contact with them. Now, in terms of sort of getting into the deeper, more complex stuff, we really found that there was this tension between English literature and history over territory. Whose responsibility was it to teach cultural history? Were English teachers going beyond their perceived perceived remit by teaching cultural history to give context to the literature or poetry or prose that they were looking at? Certainly history teachers that we spoke to felt very protective over the history of the First World War that they felt had been incorrectly taught at year 8 through English literature, and then they were having to deal with the whole Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon obsession when it got to year 9 and history was appearing in the history curriculum, when the First World War history was appearing. Another interesting complication or tension was this divide, or this tension between a sense of teaching history as objective and teaching a history of the First World War, where teachers felt an obligation to build in empathy or some kind of moral stance on the war, whether that was, not to oversimplify it, going down an anti-war route or a critical route, or whether it was about issues of sacrifice, duty and honour and patriotism. So certainly we teased out in the focus groups this tension between the fact that the First World War is an ideal subject to get students thinking about empathy, to put themselves in the shoes of a historical character that they can relate to, they can almost touch, they can research and find out about. But yet at the same time, what damage does empathy do to your objective standpoint to try and look at these characters out of, not trying taking them out of history? And finally, I think our main finding was that the key challenge for teachers, particularly in the centenary, or that the centenary is providing teachers with a great opportunity in teaching the First World War, but teachers have to find new ways to make it matter to each new generation of pupils. And this is often through adopting a regional or local perspective. And the implications that might have for schools in more urban areas and multi-ethnic areas. How do they get these regional hooks and this sense of locality? So I'm now going to take on the guise of Anne-Marie Ironhouse and walk you through some of the specific English pathway results of our survey and of our focus groups. Now, interestingly, when we put the survey out, the survey had an English pathway to follow and a history pathway to follow. The response rate to our English pathway was significantly lower than our history pathway, which in itself suggests an interesting conclusion that teachers more naturally affiliate the First World War as a historical topic than a topic in English literature. So there are a much smaller number of respondents, but still some interesting results to share with you. So these two graphs indicate the types of books and the types of authors that teachers are most likely to have access to in their stock cupboard, and thus are most likely to teach. And first of all, at first glance, you see a dominance of the canonical writers, which is obviously perpetuated by very logistical, practical concerns, as I've identified already. If you've already got a particular poetry anthology in stock, then it's going to be a hard case to advocate for a new one. And then you can see the correlation between the types of books in stock and the types of authors that are being taught. That said, we were really struck by, in the free text answers, the number of teachers who, of their own volition, were trying to bring in alternative voices. Eva Dobell, a nurse poet, Rudyard Kipling, James Baxter, a New Zealand poet, son of a conscientious objector, Margaret Postgate Cole, a socialist poet and brother of a conscientious objector. So we were seeing a wide variety of voices coming in through the minority responses, if you like. So I don't think that the overarching canonical writers present the whole picture. But really it does boil down to questions of accessibility and funding. But there's also another consideration, which is that of literary quality. And this is a quote from Andrew Bradford, Chair of Examiners at OCR, one of the major exam boards in this country. And he says that, in his view, our job as English literature teachers is to offer interesting poems which use vivid language and show how poetry works. It's not the role of English to give a wider and balanced picture of the war. So in his view, it's about the quality, it's about the literary significance of the material students are exposed to. Whether or not they portray a wide view of the war or a varied view of the war is irrelevant in Bradford's perspective. That said, our English literature respondents beg to differ. This slide indicates what English pathway respondents rated as their most important or very important goals when teaching First World War literature. And what we've done is colour-coded these responses. So they teach the First World War because of literary analysis. So Bradford's point about literary quality and significance is in green. But that's almost as significant as cultural history, which is in red. So clearly there is a very varied opinion amongst English teachers as to what their goal is when they teach the First World War through literature. Orange are sort of generic goals, development of critical skills, exploring personal development in reaction to hardship. And the highlight in pink are what we coded as sort of moral lessons. So teaching certain values like the cost of war, futility of war, or reflecting on values such as duty and sacrifice. So these are some very tentative conclusions from our English side of things before I move on to the last part of my presentation, which is looking at history. So first of all, there were very conflicted goals and mixed motivations for teaching First World War literature, as the previous slide has indicated. And there's definitely a tension between practical, aesthetic and ideological considerations. Our research highlighted the impracticality of teaching poetry as history. And as a result, instead of building walls between English literature and history, what we would recommend is the need for much closer cross-curricular working. In fact, one of the basic recommendations we would make is that First World War literature is taught in English whilst it's being taught as First World War is being taught at history. In other words, bring it both to Year 9 or bring it both to Year 8, so that there is this ability to have synergy between the two disciplines rather than erecting these false disciplinary boundaries and saying, hands off, that's not your job. Okay, so the history pathway results. As I've said, we had a much larger response to our history pathway survey. 76% of those who responded taught First World War history at Key Stage 3 as the main level. It wasn't necessarily the exclusive level, but that was the main level. Teachers identified that it was a very important topic that needed to be taught, and they wanted to teach it, or they felt it was important to teach First World War history before it became optional, so before it became part of GCSE or A level, to ensure that the most number of students could be exposed to First World War history. And the reason why reflects sort of wider popular opinion that the First World War is one of the seminal events in British and global 20th century history, and thus students should be exposed to it, much like students should be exposed to the teaching of the Holocaust. At Key Stage 4 and above, Edexcel and AQA were the most popular exam boards amongst respondents, and both of those feature the First World War as part of their exam spec. And whilst we were conducting this project, we were very, very aware that there were a large number of reforms going on within the national curriculum. And one of the product managers that was involved from Edexcel that was involved in our research project said that she felt it was highly likely that the First World War would remain within the national curriculum, either as a discrete topic or part of a broader topic area. She was saying that reforms or not, the First World War is a subject that's here to stay. So, one of the questions we asked our respondents, what topics do you cover when you teach the First World War? And I think it's very striking that the top 3 answers are the classic subject areas of the First World War in the British context. Trench warfare, origins and causes of the war, and we would suggest that that's particularly popular because origin and causation is a key skill that is meant to be developed within history at secondary level. So the origins and causes of the war is a neat topic to explore causation. The Western Front. Now, how trench warfare and the Western Front differ, I'm not entirely clear, but they did come up as 2 distinct topics. And at number 4, propaganda. Now, this I found particularly intriguing, and I'm going slightly off-piste here to say that when we delved into this question in the focus groups, it was revealed that teachers, if they're history teachers or English teachers, whatever, they have to do cross-curricular learning. And propaganda was an interesting way to bring in ICT because of e-safety. So if you can get students to analyse a propaganda poster, by default you're helping them to unpack what they see on the internet and to develop e-safety skills, which I found fascinating. Propaganda also appeared because of the importance of primary sources, and visual propaganda posters are a brilliant primary source for younger age groups to engage in and to decode and unpack. Now, this certainly raised alarm bells in terms of a very limited view of the war, and you'll notice that the more sort of alternative subjects, perhaps even the hidden histories, particularly colonialism, other fronts, the war in Africa, it really is much lower down in terms of the frequency of topic. But delving a bit deeper into our research results, one of the questions we asked our both history and English literature teachers was, how do you stay up to date with recent historiography or recent secondary literature? And reading and web research was the most common way of staying up to date. So we asked teachers to give examples. And these were some of the most frequently cited examples of literature that they'd been engaging with. And out of the 35 authors listed in response to this question, 14 of them come from what I and others, such as Heather Jones, Alan Kramer, would describe as the sort of regeneration school of First World War history. Those who are trying to push for more complex, more nuanced narratives, for alternative histories to be heard. So in a sense, we were quite reassured by the number of up-to-date historians involved in this list. But that said, I think you can see a particular picture just by the front covers of these books. It's very Western Front, it's very Somme, it's very Ypres, Passchendaele, it's very military, it's very much about the men, the war. So I think there's two sides to this coin. I think there's a reason to be hopeful that teachers are engaging with historians who are engaged in the most recent research. But the types of publications that are affordable and popular do remain those that speak to the dominant topics. What resources have you used to teach the First World War? Well, obviously historical documents and textbooks appear very high in that list, not least because of the absolute link between exam boards and the textbooks that they produce. Blackadder Goes Forth is up there at number 4. 85% I think of history teachers utilised it, and 36% of English teachers did. Which leads me to my next point, Go Vadder, which I've already referred to. But it was one of these moments where Anne-Marie and I just thought, you know, it was a confirmation almost a year into our project that we were onto something, you know, that our concerns were actually something that was being expressed by, at the time, the Secretary of State for Education. I'm delighted to call him the former Secretary of State for Education, but now he's in justice, God knows what's going to happen to us. But anyway, Michael Gove, who criticised the purportedly unpatriotic left-wing views of the First World War, which then led to a very heated, very public debate in the newspapers about the way Blackadder Goes Forth was used in British classrooms. Now, the previous slide indicates that it is used, but it doesn't really reveal how it's used. And I think there's a really oversimplified assumption that teachers are sticking a DVD on, pressing play, and doing nothing more with it. At the very least, undirected viewing as a teaching method will get you an absolute fail if you're Ofsted inspected. So the idea that teachers were being that lazy is I think, it's doing a real disservice to the profession. Louise Birch, who was involved in our project, is a head of history. She wrote in the History Vault, and I've highlighted the main area that I want you to zoom in on. Yes, teachers do use Blackadder in the classroom, but they do not teach Blackadder as fact. People like Gove and Paxman and other unnamed military historians who criticise teachers for using Blackadder fail to think how they might be using it in a reflective way, as an opportunity to think about how the First World War has been portrayed over time, how we might use Blackadder as a window into learning to hook attention on a rainy 4 p.m. Friday afternoon, and then utilise that to explore varying perspectives. Of course, there are teachers who use Blackadder in an anachronistic and oversimplified way, but certainly the teachers we spoke to very much were like Louise Birch. So I'm coming to a close. This is an indication of the same question, but to history teachers. Why do you think it's important to teach the First World War? Why do you do it? I think the results here are really interesting. Yes, there are the generic skills, so critical skills, thinking about society. But there's very clearly moral lessons in there as well as specific history goals. So key facts, utilising primary source material, developing links between one historical event and the rest of the 20th century. When we question teachers about these responses in the focus groups, we had some really interesting feedback about the impact of geography on teaching. So if you work in an area that is a heavily militarised area, I mean, I work for the University of Exeter, so Devon and Cornwall are very naval, very military areas. That is going to have an impact on how you teach. It's much more difficult for a teacher to come in and talk about slaughter and destruction when you've got kids in the classroom whose parents are away on active service. That said, there's also issues about ethnic diversity in the classroom, and how the First World War is taught then. If you are using local hooks and going to a war memorial and looking at the names of the men, you know, does that really speak to the vast majority of kids in a class in Bradford or London? Teachers also drew out that they felt horror and futility were two very different things, so that they were able to distinguish and nuance that in their teaching. But there's clearly a split, between practical objectives, so key concepts and processes that teachers of history have to get through in their programme of study, and value-driven objectives that are very much subjective and based on the teacher's own perception. And variables that affected this was, of course, you know, if you came from a military background, or the teacher came from a military background, age and experience of teachers. So those teachers that tended to be closer to the Second World War generation were much more likely to be covering the topic in terms of duty and sacrifice. Younger teachers, much closer to that, you know, to having just come out of their PGCE, were much better able to bring in questions of decolonisation and diversity. So this is my final slide, and I'll finish here. Just some tentative conclusions from history. There are many ways of using or not using Blackadder, and I think that people like Michael Gove and others are doing a great disservice to the profession of teaching in this country to suggest that teachers are using it in an unsupported and uncritical way. That said, there does remain a dominance of particular topics, which potentially restricts understanding to a narrow and Anglo-centric view of the war that emphasises horror above all other experiences. Committed and enthusiastic teachers definitely try to educate themselves and tap into the latest First World War historiography. But if these ideas don't infiltrate exam board specs, they're unlikely to be given classroom time. Also, the results of self-motivated research may not sit easily with an overarching sense of obligation to teach the war's history, to develop a pupil's capacity for empathy and a moral stance on war more generally. And finally, a point I've just made, generational, so age and geographical proximity, inform the way history teachers teach the subject of the First World War and why they teach it. And that's my question slide, but we're having another speaker yet, so we'll hold on for the questions. Thank you very much for listening.